Good evening, everybody. It's good to see you all. Welcome to Gettysburg National Military Park. I don't have any voice amplification tonight, so I'm going to do the best I can. But if you can't hear me, give a wave in the back, and I'll try to jack it up. My name is Chris. I'm one of the Rangers here, and I'm really grateful that you chose to spend this beautiful evening here in the battlefield with us, talking about a subject that I at least find very, very interesting. So we're going to spend probably about 45 minutes tonight talking here on Seminary Ridge, and then we'll have some time for some questions. And my hope is that at the end of our time together, you have, if not a greater understanding, at least a better appreciation for the event that I'm going to talk about, which is the final reunion of the surviving Civil War veterans, which occurred on this battlefield, July 1st through 4, 1938. So between July 1st and July 4th, some 1,854 surviving Civil War veterans returned to the Gettysburg battlefield. They came from every state in the Union, with the exception of Rhode Island. They came from Canada. They came from 2 other countries. They came from Washington, D.C. They traveled an average of 700 miles to reach the battlefield. Average of 700 miles. Their average age was 94. The oldest was alleged to be 112. Do I believe he was 112? No, I do not. Do I think he was very old? Yes, I do. He was very old. The youngest, the baby of the reunion, was 88 years old. They traveled entirely at the expense of the United States government. The government paid for everything. Their train travel, for their lodging, everything. And then for those 4 days, really, they held the reunion, the last reunion of the surviving Civil War veterans. And it also happened to be the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. And when you think back on Civil War history, there were representatives at this reunion of some of the most famous units in the American Civil War. So, Webb's Brigade, for example, which fought on Cemetery Ridge on July 3rd. The Stonewall Brigade representatives were here. The United States Colored Troops, the 54th Massachusetts, and the list goes on and on. The Irish Brigade. You didn't have to be a veteran of the Battle of Gettysburg. You could have fought in any campaign of the American Civil War, from New Mexico to the Spanish or the Florida coast. All you had to do was be able to prove you were a Civil War veteran. The single biggest event to ever happen in Gettysburg, the single biggest event to ever happen here, was not the battle. It was the 75th anniversary and the reunion. There were an estimated 450,000 people that came to Gettysburg over those 4 days. It got so bad that on July 3rd, Pennsylvania state troopers started to guard the roads and turn people around. There just wasn't any more room to accommodate them. This anniversary would also be the occasion for the dedication of arguably one of the more famous monuments on the battlefield, and that's the Eternal Light Peace Memorial, dedicated on July 3rd, 1938, by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It got national attention. Film crews were here, radio crews were here. Virtually every major newspaper in the United States and in England was present to see this event. And I think even the people who were participating in it, the veterans, I think they recognized that a chapter in history was closing. It was moving on. And I think one of the things I want you to leave with today is that the 1938 reunion, even today, still shapes how we visit this battlefield, how we understand maybe the American Civil War. But I will also say that reunion in 1938 is shrouded, like a lot of Gettysburg, it's shrouded in a tremendous amount of legend and mystery. And this image that I have up on the screen, I think really captures that. So this is an image taken on Cemetery Ridge at some point during the reunion. And in a lot of ways, this image encapsulates one of the themes of that reunion in 1938. And that was the idea that men who had once fought each other on the battlefield, a generation later, could put those bitter feelings and hatreds aside, come back as countrymen once again, and hopefully leave as friends. So this idea of reconciliation, right? These two halves of the country coming together. That was really the big theme in 1938. But in a lot of ways, as we're going to see, that wasn't always the case with the veterans themselves. And even this picture, this image that you see, it's available on the Library of Congress. You can zoom in really, really closely. And I think a lot of people look at that and they assume it is this, spontaneous moment of friendship and comradeship. These, old Confederate veterans and these old Union veterans meet at the stone wall and they shake hands. Well, in reality, if you look really closely at that image, well, you'll notice there's a little wire running down the length of the stone wall to a little microphone that's exactly beneath where they're shaking hands. And then another view, it's a little bit wider, and you can see all these buses parked along the roadway. Well, what this was, in actuality, was a really carefully choreographed event where they shipped and bussed these guys out here, and they staged this. Now, that doesn't mean that the feelings weren't earnest or genuine, but it didn't happen out of the blue. And I think that's one of the most interesting aspects of this event. The planning and the organization that had to go into it. And that's one of the things we'll talk about today as we delve into this topic. So, if we're going to talk about reunions on the battlefield, to have a little bit of context. Because they didn't happen all that often. When I say that, I mean Union and Confederate reunions didn't happen all that often on the battlefield together. Usually, when Civil War veterans came back to Gettysburg, they came back with their buddies, with their comrades, and maybe their kids and their grandkids, to dedicate a monument or to participate in some event. But those joint reunions, they didn't happen all that often. And when they did, they got a lot of attention simply because they were rare. The first, what we would really call a blue-gray reunion, happens in 1887. And this is when veterans of Pickett's division, some Confederates, and representatives of Alexander Webb's brigade met at the high water mark on the Gettysburg battlefield. We're talking about a couple hundred Civil War veterans for this one reunion. And for the individuals involved, it was this transcendent moment. They met again on the battlefield. There are stories where, veterans are swapping uniforms and indulging way too much downtown and causing a ruckus, but it proved that these kind of events could happen in Gettysburg. Probably the most famous reunion occurs in 1913. And this is the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg and the occasion of the Grand Peace Reunion, the Grand Peace Jubilee. What you have in 1913 are roughly 44,000 Union veterans and maybe as many as 6,000 Confederate veterans coming back to the Gettysburg battlefield. So this was a massive event. You're talking about thousands of tents, hundreds of field kitchens, a massive event. Present was Woodrow Wilson, then President of the United States. He declared the Civil War was, quote, a quarrel forgotten and the country was moving on. And again, this caused an international interest, this 1913 reunion. And on the very last day of that reunion in 1913, the then governor of Pennsylvania, in front of the collected audience, made a promise. He made a pledge. He said that if there were any veterans still alive in 25 years' time, the state of Pennsylvania would invite them back for one last reunion. And with that, the 1913 reunion came to a close. The veterans went back home, and the country moved on. And I think it's no surprise to anybody who knows anything about United States history that those intervening years, those decades between 1913 and 1938, there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on. So we have changes in technology. Something simple like a radio, which was a rarity in 1913, by the 1930s is a household appliance. You have changes to the United States Constitution. Women get the vote at the end of the 19-teens. We have, of course, the Great World War, First World War. Automobiles come to dominate the American landscape were relatively unknown in 1913. They existed, but they weren't the commonplace things they would be by the 1930s. And of course, there's the Great Depression, which begins in the latter part of the 1920s and the first year of the 1930s, which would fundamentally rework American society. And with all these changes going on, with all of these things happening, the Gettysburg National Park was evolving too. So it was changing too. Where at one time it was really a park to the Union veterans. It was a Union Memorial Park. By the 1930s, that's starting to change. Where now you have monuments to the state of Alabama, and North Carolina, and Virginia. So the park itself is evolving and it's changing. In 1933, a pretty big thing would happen. For the first time ever, the National Park Service will arrive on the Gettysburg battlefield. They'll take over control of the battlefield from the United States War Department. And up until this time, the Park Service, they really didn't do battlefields. They did big nature parks like Yosemite and Yellowstone, but until Franklin Roosevelt, they had never managed battlefield parks. So this foray was going to be something new, something a little novel. And you look at this gentleman here, his name is James McConaughey. Anybody know who he is? He's the first superintendent of the park. He's the first leader of the park. And he'll arrive in 1933, and he will institute, using money from the New Deal, a lot of the things in the park that we still use today. So, for example, a lot of the trails, the comfort stations at the west end and south end. That's his work. He'll do a lot of wonderful things. He'll do some questionable things as well. He was not a historian by training. He was a landscape architect. And he felt that the battlefield was too cluttered with monuments. And so one of his first ideas was he was going to go out and plant trees around each monument to kind of shield them from view. That didn't work out real well. He found the National Cemetery, the stones where the Gettysburg dead are buried, well, they used to be raised. And they were causing problems with mowing and weed whacking. They were getting all out of joint. And so he lowered them to be flush with the ground. And that's the reason they look like they do today, which was never really the plan. He establishes the first visitor center for the battlefield park. It's today where the public library is in downtown Gettysburg. And for McConaughey, for all his actions, I think he did recognize one fundamental truth. That Gettysburg, by 1933, was going from a lived event, an event that was within the living memory, to a remembered event, where that event was entirely in the past and there was no more any living connection to it. And visitors to Gettysburg now would no longer be able to use a veteran to tell the story of the battle. And it was going to be the Park Service that would have to fill in, and the licensed battlefield guides that existed since 1915. So I think he recognizes those fundamental changes. So as I mentioned, they do a lot of wonderful things, but truly by the 30s, it is the end of an era. By the 1930s, Civil War veterans are dying at a rate of about 1,000 a year. The Grand Army of the Republic, which was once an absolute political powerhouse, it was composed of Union veterans. At one time, it numbered half a million representatives. It would, help sway political elections. It was quite the force. By the 1930s, it had dwindled down to only 2,000 members. So these Civil War veterans, they're dying off. That chapter in America's past is being turned. And it's around that time, 1933, 1934, that all of a sudden the state of Pennsylvania, they remember that promise that the governor made back in 1913 to hold one final reunion. And so the state of Pennsylvania would create a commission. And here are our commissioners. And they're going to be responsible for organizing, funding, and executing the 75th anniversary reunion at the Gettysburg battlefield. Now, the head of the commission was the gentleman on the left. His name was John S. Rice. And John Rice was a politician. He spoke very well. He knew a lot of people. And I think in any organization, there's the face of the organization. The face, the public representation. And then there's the guy that gets everything done. And so, John Rice, I would call him the face. The gentleman on the right, he's in his mid-30s. His name is Paul Roy. He's going to be the guy that gets everything done. He is a newspaperman from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, Paul Roy. And he's going to be the executive secretary of this Pennsylvania commission. And Paul Roy, he knows he's got a number of challenges. One, Pennsylvania, they created a commission, but they didn't give the commission any money. So they have almost no funding to work with. It's the middle of the Great Depression. And Paul Roy wonders, are the American people, are they even interested in this? Do they even care? It's tough to care about a Civil War reunion when you don't have a job and you can't buy food for your children. And then the other question for Paul Roy, and this is maybe the biggest one, do the veterans even want to do this? Do the Union and Confederate veterans still alive in 1935, do they even want to do it? Do they even care about it? Because, and perhaps this is not surprising, but there was still a lot of animosity between these two sides, the Union and Confederate veterans. There was still a lot of bitterness there. And Paul Roy would write in his history of this event, and he would say, quote, "At first blush, it seemed financially and physically impossible, a monumental task for which there was a painful lack of enthusiasm." As I mentioned, probably his biggest challenge was convincing the veterans to buy into this idea, to come back to Gettysburg. And as I was just saying, there was a lot that still divided them. In terms of reunions, one of the biggest obstacles was the Confederate battle flag. Repeatedly, Confederate veterans would say, "I'm not going to any reunion where I can't bring my flag. I'm not going to do it." Meanwhile, United States veterans, they would say, "Yeah, I'll go to a reunion, but I don't want to see that flag. I don't want to look at it. I don't want to march past it. I don't want to see it." And so that was just one example of something that was going to make this reunion very difficult to achieve. And so what Paul Roy does is he basically embarks on this guerrilla campaign to convince these old guys to come back to Gettysburg. In 1935, he goes to Amarillo, Texas, because that's where the Confederate veterans are going to have their annual massive reunion of the United Confederate Veterans. That was their organization. Now, Paul Roy is not invited. He just shows up. And Roy knows that he's really got to sway this one guy. And that's the gentleman on the right. And his name is Harry Lee. He is no relation to Robert E. Lee. But he is the Adjutant General of the United Confederate Veterans. And Harry Lee wants nothing to do with the Gettysburg Reunion. Some of the press, newspapermen tipped him off that this guy from Gettysburg might approach him about a Gettysburg Reunion in 1938. And the reporters wanted to know what Harry Lee was going to tell him. What was he going to say? And Harry Lee reported that he was, quote, going to tell him to go to hell. So that's the kind of opposition that Paul Roy's running into. Well, he corners Harry Lee in the lobby of this hotel where they're having the reunion. And they have some harsh words. Ultimately, they have some mint juleps. And by the end of that meeting, Harry Lee is all about going to Gettysburg. So Paul Roy, he was able to convince him. Now he has to go that same year to Grand Rapids, Michigan. That's where the Union veterans are meeting. That's the meeting place of the Grand Army of the Republic. Now, the Union veterans, they wouldn't even actually formally recognize him. They wouldn't let him speak. And so he has to conduct this quasi-marketing campaign over the radio, trying to reach Union veterans who might be listening. And the Grand Army of the Republic would never formally approve of the 1938 reunion. They basically told their membership, if you want to go, go, but we're not going to officially recognize it. But ultimately, Paul Roy did his job. He was able to convince a lot of Confederate veterans and a lot of Union veterans to buy into this idea. And Harry Lee, by the year prior to the anniversary, would tell a newspaper that he was going to go to Gettysburg if they have to take him there on a stretcher. And unfortunately, Harry Lee would not make it to Gettysburg. He dies in 1937, 1 year short of the reunion. And that, ultimately, that was going to be the single greatest factor in whether or not this reunion was a success. It wasn't the money, it wasn't the interest, it was, are these guys going to survive? Are they going to live to 1938? In 1935, the Pennsylvania Commission worked with the United States government and most of the southern states to try to get an accounting of how many Civil War veterans were left and where they lived. And that year they sent out about 12,000, we'll call them RSVPs. Are you going to attend the reunion? What do you think about it? They sent out about 12,000. Of those, 30% were returned, meaning the individual was dead. 70% reached their intended soldier. Of those 12,000, about 3,000 said they were interested. About 3,000. 1 year before the reunion, they sent out a formal invitation. And this time that 3,000 had dwindled down to 2,000. And by the time of the reunion itself, only 1,845 of the initial 12,000 that they reached out to actually made it to the battlefield, actually made it to Gettysburg. Now, the United States government estimated that during a normal 2-week stretch, in a normal 2 weeks, about 15 veterans would die. Just normal activity. Now I want you to imagine, you're moving these veterans, some of them 1,000 miles. They're staying in army tents out on the battlefield. The single greatest concern of the commission was that when the veterans get here, they're going to start to die. And so they reached out to the United States government, particularly the military, for help. And this gentleman on the left, his name is Paul Hawley, and he's a military doctor. He was in charge of the 1st Medical Regiment, which was stationed up in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And he's going to be the guy responsible for medical care for the veterans who make it to Gettysburg. And early on, they decided they are going to give these guys whatever they need. So it's not like today where they're going to check their insurance, and if a veteran needs something, he's going to get it. And Paul Hawley was estimating that during those 4 days, around 90 veterans were going to die in his care. Around 90. He would later write, no one could approach the problem of medical care of a large group of aged persons without considerable apprehension. Now, during the reunion itself, once the veterans got here, they were going to be held in a tent city. Hundreds, thousands of tents would be set up in the area directly north of where Gettysburg College is. And the college campus itself will be taken over by this reunion. The camps were going to be segregated, not by race, but by side, by section. So all the Union veterans would be in one section, and all the Confederate veterans would be in another. And that's going to solve that flag problem that Paul Roy was worried about. He's going to tell the Confederate veterans, guess what? You can bring your flag. He's going to tell the Union veterans, don't worry, you don't have to see it. You don't have to march past it. We're going to put them way over in the corner. That's the deal he cuts, basically. Connecting all of those tents would be miles of wooden boardwalk that would enable wheelchairs to travel to and from the camp. They would establish mess halls throughout the camp to provide food for these guys 3 times a day. They would run phone lines, electricity. They take over the college buildings. One's going to be a hospital. The other is going to be, for 4 days, the state headquarters of the state of Pennsylvania. So the capital will relocate to Gettysburg for this reunion. So these are the college buildings that I mentioned that will be taken over by the reunion. Every veteran would get their own tent. And in that tent would be everything they would need to be comfortable. So,
air conditioner?
No air conditioning, no. No air conditioning.
And it was 85.
Everything beyond air conditioning. It's going to be a typical July weekend in 1938. So highs in the 80s, humid. They'll have not air conditioning, but a cot and a chair, a water heater, things like that. Everything that would make them comfortable. So as I mentioned, the camp's going to be segregated. The Union veterans are going to be directly north of the college campus, along what is today Howard Avenue. The Confederates, they'll be over there in the corner there. They're not expecting as many Confederates to come, that's why. So they'll be beyond the Mummersburg Road. Legions of Boy Scouts are going to be rounded up to help out with the reunion. Now, when I was a young ranger, I actually met a guy who lived here in 1938, and he was a Boy Scout, and he remembers working this reunion and being paired up with this Confederate veteran. Just like today, there's going to be an Abraham Lincoln impersonator present at all Civil War themed events. But ultimately, whether or not the veterans decided to come to Gettysburg was going to be, I think, an intensely personal choice. And in homes across the United States, you can almost imagine a scenario playing out that was similar to what these guys went through, maybe in 1861, when they're telling their family they're going to enlist. You know, kids, I want to go to Gettysburg. I want to travel to Gettysburg for the reunion. Every veteran had to bring an attendant. And this person would be responsible for keeping their veteran alive over the course of the reunion. The first veteran who arrives in Gettysburg does so 2 weeks early. He was Alvin Tolman. He was 90 years old. When the newspaper asked, why did you arrive so early? He said he was going to, quote, get the pick of the Gettysburg women. That was why he arrived so early. That's not the funny part. The funny part is he brought his wife. Representing the Union Army, their kind of de facto leader was the gentleman on the left, Overton Bennett. He was a doctor. He came all the way from Los Angeles, California. The individual on the far right is John C. Claypool. John Claypool will be the Confederate leader at this reunion. He had been wounded 3 times in the war. Fought at Stones River, Murfreesboro, fought at Chickamauga. And he again is going to represent the Confederates. Some veterans coming back decided to bring their rifles with them, like these guys from Louisiana. Others came from as far away as Oklahoma. There was one veteran. His name was Nicholas G. Van Zant. And Nicholas Van Zant, he came to the reunion. And he was the only man in attendance who could claim to be a veteran of both the American Civil War and the First World War. He drove an ambulance in France during the First World War. The veteran who traveled the least was this man, George Krug. He was 92 years old. He came from Littlestown, Pennsylvania, which was only about 10 miles away. He was almost in his backyard. As I mentioned, about 1,845 veterans come back to Gettysburg. They actually arrive. They're here in the reunion. Now, of those, about 58 of them are veterans who actually fought at the Battle of Gettysburg. About 58 actually participated in the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, among those 1,845 veterans were members of regiments that were part of the United States Colored Troops or that were composed of African Americans. Now, in 1913, as far as we know, there are no black veterans that actively participate in the reunion. The situation in 1938 is going to be very, very different. And initially, I thought I was very skeptical about what I was going to find in regards to race in the reunion. What I found shocked me. The African American veterans who came to Gettysburg found a tent set up where they weren't segregated. They were sleeping right next to a tent with a white guy. They would go to the mess hall and they would be seated in the order that they came and not segregated by race. And now some of these guys, they're coming from the Deep South. They're coming from places like Baltimore, Maryland, where it is heavily segregated. So in that respect, the Gettysburg Reunion, quote unquote, erases the color line. And this was something that these men, these veterans, they had not experienced before. So that's going to make this unique. One black newspaperman would report, quote, all traces of discrimination, both as to racial identity and geographical location, were absent. All eat together, vets filed in side by side to be seated. No one moved away from his neighbor diner but began a conversation. Of the veterans who actually fought at the Battle of Gettysburg was one gentleman. His name was George Hamilton. He was 89 years old. He fought in the 140th Pennsylvania. And he remembers vividly charging through the wheat field on July 2nd, second day of the battle. He would complain that the battlefield didn't look like he remembered it from July 2nd, 1863, and he criticized the Park Service for letting all the grass grow too high, which, if you read my mail today, is almost the exact thing I get. Still, some things don't change. William Jackaway, 97 years old, was the last surviving veteran of the 72nd Pennsylvania. And at one point in the reunion, he goes out to Cemetery Ridge, where the 72nd monument is. And this gaggle of reporters watch him go up to the monument, and they see him trace the lettering with his finger, overcome with emotion. And he would whisper to the newspapermen around him something to the effect of, never forget they were a fine bunch of fellows. There's one veteran. His name's James P. Hamaker, and he served in Company G of the 50th Virginia. They were involved in the Battle of Culp's Hill. And he's wounded at Culp's Hill, and he's captured. So Gettysburg is his last battle. But he lives. After the war, he moves out to Texas, and he's one of those Confederate veterans that decides he wants to go to Gettysburg. Well, he gets on his train, and as the train is almost to Gettysburg, it's rounding a bend near Baltimore, Maryland, he's up in his bunk. And as the train turns, he falls out of the bunk and lands on the floor of the train. And he breaks his pelvis. They transport him immediately from the train station to a hospital. And even the last day of the reunion, he was still begging the nurses to bring him out to the battlefield so he could visit the spot where he was wounded one last time. And he never got to do it. One of the most famous veterans to come back to the reunion was this fella. His name was Otto R. Gillette. He's 93 years old, and he fought in the 2nd Mississippi. Now, if you know about the 2nd Mississippi, that is one of the Confederate regiments involved in Pickett's charge. And he was, as far as I know, the only Confederate present in 1938 who participated in Pickett's charge. So he becomes a celebrity. He becomes a celebrity. And one of the things we notice about the reunion, especially Otto R. Gillette, is that the longer the reunion goes on, he has this kind of elastic memory that starts to stretch out of all proportions. So he'd start to tell reporters that he was friends with Jefferson Davis, and that Jeb Stuart's banjo player taught him how to play the banjo, and how he studied under Robert E. Lee after the war at Washington College. He kept underneath his tent, under his cot in his tent, this jug of whiskey. And anyone that came to talk to him had to take a swig of whiskey with him. But he became quite the celebrity. He's actually, and I don't know if you're going to be able to hear this, but I'm going to try. He was actually interviewed by a radio company about Pickett's charge. And I tried to embed the audio, so we'll see if it plays. It's playing, but you can't hear it. I know you can't hear that, but he's telling the story of Pickett's charge. So this reporter who chastises him for running away. And Otto R. Gillette says, well, if any Confederate tells you he didn't run away, he's telling you a damn lie. Now you can actually go home and Google that, and you can listen to the audio of the conversation. It's quite good. There were no shortage of liars at the 1938 reunion. One of the larger liars was William Barnes, who was in the 1st United States Colored Troops Heavy Artillery. And he was born in Kentucky. He was born a slave. And he claimed to be 112 years old. Now, as I said at the beginning, I don't think he was actually 112, but I do think he didn't know how old he was. He was born a slave. And so he was guessing, he was estimating. He knew he was really old, but he didn't know exactly how old. When one of the reporters asked him, what is your key to longevity? He said he drank a gallon of gin a month, and that's what kept him alive so long. The biggest liar of all was probably this guy. John Saling claimed to be a Confederate veteran. Subsequent research showed that he was 5 years old in 1865. And what we think happened is he was poor and he wanted to get a pension. So he pretended to be a Confederate veteran to collect the pension. And then it just snowballed out of proportion to the point where he's at Gettysburg in 1938 as a general in the Confederate veterans. Not a Confederate veteran at all. They were celebrities, though. The veterans, everywhere they went, they were celebrities. They found out this guy, Martin Luke, 96 years old, at the top of the tower, the observation tower over on Oak Ridge, which if you go there today, it's about half the size today that it was in 1938. And he was up at the top signing autographs. One man said he was asked to sign so many autographs, he started charging a penny an autograph. And he was thrilled to report by the end of the day he had 80 cents in signing autographs. Now, the veterans, they ate at set times. So you'd have a time for breakfast, time for lunch, time for dinner. But you could help yourself to the, there was basically a whiskey station. You could help yourself to that anytime you wanted. They'd make you a hot toddy and whiskey. And according to one attendant, they were always in the mood for it. And so there was a crisis the first day of the reunion when they ran out of booze. They ran out of booze the first day. And so they had to dispatch an army plane to fly to a nearby base to pick up more booze and bring it to the reunion. Now, if you were a camp attendant, you're with your veteran. It might be your dad, it might be your grandfather, it might be a friend. You have a couple of jobs. One, make sure that they eat on time. 2, keep them alive. 3, put them back on the train at the end of the event. And don't damage any government property. And if you failed at any of those, you'd be sent home early. That was your job as an attendant. Now, each day of the reunion was themed. Each day had a theme. And it begins July 1st with what was called Reunion Day. And that's mostly a day of speeches. That's when the governor will speak. That's when representatives from the Union veterans would speak and the Confederate veterans. And that's really the kickoff of this reunion. The following day would be quote-unquote Veterans Day. And this day, honestly, it was less about the Civil War veterans than it was a platform to showcase the modern United States military. So there are tanks that are there in 1938, machine guns, jeeps. There are B-17 bombers flying overhead. And in the midst of all this are these impossibly old guys who remember marching everywhere, who remember, lugging their knapsack and their haversack everywhere they went. And so I think, for those men, it must have been absolutely extraordinary to see how much technology in those 75 years had changed, how it had evolved. The highlight of the reunion was July 3rd. That was called Memorial Day, also called President's Day. And that was going to be the occasion for the dedication of a new monument on the battlefield, the Eternal Light Peace Memorial. Now there had been an idea for a peace memorial dedicated to the idea of peace, the only one on the battlefield since 1913, when the gentleman on the left, Andrew Cowan, who was a survivor of Pickett's charge, he was a Union soldier, he proffered this idea in 1913. The idea had a lot of merit. It snowballed. They created a commission with a lot of very famous people, guys like Joshua Chamberlain, and it started to really take shape. But 1914, 1 year later, World War, the banks collapse, all these guys start to die, and the idea faded away. Well, they revived it for 1938. They selected a location, Oak Hill on the Gettysburg battlefield. They selected an architect, a man by the name of Paul Philippe Cray. And their charge to that architect was to make the monument, the memorial, reflect the reunion. This idea of the North and South coming together. And so that's what he created. The base would be out of granite from the state of Maine. There'd be a long tower, a shaft that was from the state of Alabama. It was limestone. And a gas-fed flame would burn at the top. And they were going to dedicate it on July 3rd, 1938. They estimate that 250,000 people came to see this dedication. Franklin Roosevelt arrived that day and was escorted to the site of the monument, which was draped by a massive American flag. There was a selected Union and Confederate veteran who were given the honor, if you will, of at the signal to pull on a rope, and that would lower the flag, revealing the monument to those 250,000 people. And then Franklin Roosevelt would speak. He would give the keynote. And Roosevelt's Gettysburg Address was really more a message for the present than it was about the past. Roosevelt, he called the veterans in attendance a fragment spared by time. And he talked about how if these enemies could come back to the battlefield together, now as countrymen, as friends once more, what could the United States, unified, together, not achieve? I think Roosevelt he's seeing the future. The end of the Depression, but also global conflict may be on the horizon. And what he wanted to do was use these veterans as an example of what America could aspire to. And with that, the reunion was essentially over. The next day, veterans started to board train cars back to wherever they were from. The camp started to be dismantled, fall classes would begin at Gettysburg College in only a few months. And I think virtually the entire nation at that moment realized kind of the same thing we're realizing today with the World War II generation. It's passing into history. It's gone. It's passing into history. Now that same year, 1938, at the same time even, you have the rise of Nazism in Germany. You have rallies at Nuremberg. You have the Empire of Japan invading China. So as the story of one conflict is closing, a new, larger, much more deadly one would be just beginning. Now, for the reunion itself, remember I told you that the medical officer, Paul Hawley, thought that as many as 90 veterans would die during the reunion? Well, in actuality, it was far fewer than that. 2 during the reunion itself would die. 2 out of 1,845. Now, virtually every single veteran in attendance in 1938 visited the doctor's office or an aid station. They all got treated in some shape, but only 2 died during the reunion. Some died on the way there, a number died on the way home. But that's far less than the 90 they were planning for. Far less than the 90. Only 1 veteran went missing. Only 1. His name was James Handick. He was 104 years old, and he just vanished from the camps. He was found a few weeks later in Philadelphia, asleep at a baseball game. But he was the only one that went missing. Now, Paul Hawley, the medical officer I told you about, now he would later go on to command the medical detachments, or the medical operation in World War II in the European theater, including Operation Torch, which is the invasion of North Africa, as well as the Normandy campaign. And I think in part because of his experience at Gettysburg, he became a real student of Jonathan Letterman, who was the medical director for the Army of the Potomac at the time of the battle. And so he'd go from Gettysburg to the Second World War. And John Rice, he was that face of the Pennsylvania Commission. He would become ambassador to the Netherlands under John F. Kennedy. Today, if you go to Gettysburg College, there's no monument to him or anything like that, but he does have a college dorm named after him on the campus. I didn't talk a whole lot about him, but Overton Mennett, the leader of the Union veterans, he would die in 1941, just a couple of years later. That veteran I told you about, the one that fell off the train and broke his hip, pelvis, he makes it home. He makes it home to Texas, but he dies on September 5th. And so you could argue he was the last casualty, last fatality of the Battle of Gettysburg, because his death was attributable directly to the injury he suffered coming to the battlefield for the reunion. William Jackaway. He's the veteran that traced the lettering of the monument with his finger. He would become the last surviving veteran in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He makes the news one last time. That's in 1941, where he speaks to a newspaper reporter, and he publicly challenged Adolf Hitler to a fight. And he said, any style, anywhere. And he nearly outlives Hitler. Actually, he dies in 1944. Of course, Hitler dies 1 year later. William Barnes, he was the man that claimed to be 112. He's buried today out in San Francisco National Cemetery. And we've been able to kind of use census records and other archival sources to determine he wasn't 112, he was 106. That's still incredibly old, but that would make him technically the second oldest man at the reunion rather than the oldest. And then finally, there's the peace light, which is still there today, still burns all these years later. At one point in the 1970s, there's a gas shortage, and so the Park Service, they replaced the eternal flame with what they called a sodium vapor lamp. It looks like a giant light bulb. That lasted until the 1980s, until they restored the natural flame. But that still burns today, a memory not just to the battle, but also to this moment in time, this reunion of Civil War veterans. This brings us all the way back to the beginning. Now, the 1938 reunion, I think for the veterans involved, it was the last great event of their life, last great adventure of their existence. And I do think at the reunion, it is remarkable that these old men, 97, 98, 103 years old, were able to come back to this battlefield and stand next to the men that they were trying to kill 75 years before. That a black veteran from Houston, Mississippi could come back to Gettysburg and face a better society in that tent city than the one maybe he knew back home. I think that's a remarkable thing. It's a remarkable thing. And so you'll probably see this image again at some point during your visit here in your life. And I hope that you look at it maybe a different way. Maybe you notice that little wire running down the length of the stone wall to a little microphone. Maybe you notice all those cars in the background and the attendant taking this veteran off the battlefield. And think about this event, the 1938 reunion, in maybe a different way. And with that, I'll close and I'll take any questions you might have. Any questions? If not, thank you so much. I hope you have a great evening. Yeah.
Besides the newspapers, does anybody collect stories that these soldiers told and printed on any?
So there were the newspapers. There were radio men that recorded it. When the veterans themselves RSVP'd, they had sections where they could write stories or memories. And so all of those are today up at the Pennsylvania State Archives. And there are some in the National Archives at College Park. And those are fascinating. Those are fascinating. Because that's the veterans themselves talking. And some of them are like, I'm never going to Gettysburg. No way. And others are, I'll crawl. I remember fighting there in 1863 in Philly, and they tell stories through these RSVPs. So that's a great source of information. Yeah.
You said the average age was like 98 or something?
94.
94?
Yeah.
Do you know what the average age of the survivors were during the Civil War?
During the Civil War, the average age is 25, 26. Yep. Well, a little bit older than, most people think they're 18-year-olds, 16-year-olds. Average age is about 26. Nope. Yeah, it's 26. You had many 18-year-olds, don't get me wrong. But when you look at the totality of, the 3 million men in the Civil War, about 26 years old.
I mean, of the 1800s.
Of the 1800s? Oh, I don't know that anyone's ever done that research. That'd be interesting to know, though. Yeah. Obviously, they're going to skew younger, right, because they're still alive. Well, folks, have a great drive home. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much. Drive safe.